It's my pleasure to introduce Alex de Waal and his keynote speech, Ethiopia's Crises in Oromiya and Identity and State Viability. Professor de Waal is Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation and a research professor at the Fletcher School, Tufts University. He's been a researcher and practitioner in the Horn of Africa since the 1980s, working on conflict, food security, and related issues. He was the senior advisor to the African Union High-Level Panel on Sudan and South Sudan. He's listed among the Foreign Policy's 100 most influential intellectuals in 2008 and Atlantic's Brave Thinkers in 2009. He's a recipient of the Royal Anthropological Institute's Huxley Award and has written 4 books since 2015 on the Horn of Africa, famine, pandemics and politics, and on Sudan. He's no stranger to controversy and often thinks outside the box. I'm very much looking forward to hearing what Alex has to say. So over to you now, Alex, and thank you for coming.
Thank you very much, Trevor. It's an honor, it's a privilege to be with you and to take this leading role in this important conference. First of all, my condolences to many of you who have lost both loved ones and also lost dreams of what your communities and your nation could be. And so commiserations for the pain that many of you are suffering. And I just want to begin by respecting that. So facing any conflict that has turned to violence, the first obligation on the statesperson, whether a national leader or mediator or indeed an international figure, is to define the problem, because it goes without saying that if a problem is not diagnosed correctly, it cannot be solved. So let me reflect a little bit on how we might define our challenge. So the way I've framed the challenge is not as the crisis of the Oromo or the crisis of the Oromo within Ethiopia, but Ethiopia's crisis in Oromiya, or rather crises in the plural, because I think the two most significant underlying crises are the crisis of identity with which we're very familiar, and a crisis of political economy. And each of these has historical roots and continuities, manifest differently over each generation. And each time they have particular manifestations for the Oromo people, but they're fundamentally crises of the Ethiopian state. And I would argue that the issue of democracy and human rights is actually downstream from these questions. So let me look briefly at how these questions have been framed and changed over several generations. So for the Emperor Haile Selassie, the overriding question was the sovereign independence of the Ethiopian Empire, which meant that the other questions, identity, governance, development, didn't count, except insofar as they fed into that issue. In that period, the identity issue for the Oromo, I think, was encapsulated by the anthropologist Paul Baxter, who characterized the Oromo during imperial rule as, I quote, always on the outside looking in. To be exact, Oromo individuals were allowed in one by one on terms set by the gatekeepers of the state. And Oromo identity was defined both by reference to its language, culture, and history, but also was framed by the Amhara and the Ethiopian state. And Oromo identity could not be understood without looking at Amhara identity too. And indeed, the Amhara aristocracy had the privilege of defining the state and naming the Oromo. Now, a second quote concerning political economy from Marjorie Perham, who during the early 1930s described Haile Selassie as an absolute despot whose authority did not extend beyond the first checkpoint outside Addis Ababa. So this was how the King of Kings, the elect of God, ruled his empire. He kept the people poor, ignorant, ungoverned, dominated by low expectations. The student movement and the 1974 revolution were torn between the nationality question and the political economy question, which at that time was principally over land. And there was no consensus on which should be addressed first. And the revolution delivered some modest gains on nationality and some dramatic gains on land. And of course, it was the Oromo leadership that articulated the land reform agenda, though those who did so then became themselves victims of the revolution. And Oromo revolutionaries were divided as to whether to join or to resist, and they lost out on both counts. And as a collectivity, they remained on the outside looking in, though, as before, some individuals were allowed to pass. And some of the confusion among the Oromo political elite can be put down to the divisions and confusion among the Amhara political elite, who are, of course, no less divided over the revolution and its direction. But as a collectivity, the Amhara, of course, remained on the inside looking out, and individuals who chose to leave had a pass to re-enter the political establishment. And over time, the Derg co-opted their narrative, or perhaps they co-opted the Derg. The EPRDF revolution of 1991 manifested the same tension as 17 years earlier, the need to address both the nationality and the political economy question. And of course, once again, rather underappreciated perhaps, is that the federal formula was articulated most cogently by the Oromo leadership, although those leaders then became political casualties of the EPRDF. And that dispensation delivered on socio-cultural rights and on development and welfare, although these in turn generated new contradictions. It didn't deliver political rights. And the original sin of the EPRDF was the OPDO, which, in the words of Lencholeta, left the Oromo as a whole prisoners of prisoners. Nonetheless, many Oromo were ready to work within the EPRDF, taking over the OPDO from within. And again, of course, dividing the Oromo movement. And the progress during this period was profoundly ambiguous. There was an undoubted victory in elevating the Oromo language, but that was diluted because it didn't become a working language of the federal government. And the rapid growth of that period also brought tensions because the Oromo region is the best endowed in terms of fertile land, the most attractive for investment, and accelerated economic development, including urbanization, labor migration, large-scale land acquisition, caused social disruption at a faster pace than any social protection programs could ameliorate. And the formula, as enshrined in the 1995 Constitution, was also problematic because national identities evolve and change over time, or else they degenerate into what my colleague Mulugeta Gebrehiwot calls administrative nationalism. Now, we also need to look at the parallel Amhara identity and politics. They were out of power at that time, or at least many in the Amhara elite felt so. The second sin of the EPRDF was to redefine the EPDM as the ANDM and to leave unaddressed, unresolved the tensions between definitions of Amhara nationality as Abyssinian imperialism or civic republicanism, or what the EPRDF called democratic nationalism. All of these three problematic. And one of the tragedies of 2005 was that the civic republicans made common cause with revanchist Abyssinian imperialists under the banner of pan-Ethiopianism, while the ANDM failed to articulate an alternative, or indeed to speak about Amhara identity at all. Now, EPRDF Mark II under Meles Zenawi shifted. It redefined Ethiopia's national problem as one of state viability. He assumed perhaps wrongly, that the nationality issue was settled. His concern was that economic growth on the grounds that without it, and I quote, national disintegration cannot be ruled out. In that, I believe he was correct. And he described the challenge of governing Ethiopia as running in front of an avalanche. His strategy was to outrun the socio-political and regional, that is, international security challenges through being ahead of the game. He was aware of the tensions within the nationality settlement, but took no steps to address it or even to open up the necessary debate. And the federal constitution needed to breathe, to adapt to a fast-changing Ethiopia, or become a cage, which is what indeed happened. And as a result, Haile Mariam Desalegn presided over a remarkable economic boom, but also destabilization and an unsustainable political system. The uprising that brought this to an end was both a political uprising and also a claim for socio-economic rights. It was a revolution, I think, of rising expectations, and it went, as we know, terribly awry. Abiy Ahmed inherited a functioning state, a fast-developing economy, and a consensus across the board that the repressive ways of the EPRDF were now history. There are few leaders taking on the complex task of a political transition, of democratization from above, who had such strong cards in their hands. And Abiy took them for granted and wasted them. He didn't even try to define the problem. Rather, he assumed he possessed the magical formula for solving every problem, real or imagined. And the Oromo vacillated between joining and resisting, and the Amhara doubled down on a vengeful, revanchist nationalism that masked the differences among them. And we have rarely seen the politics of hatred in such pure, distilled form. Hatred such as this becomes its own punishment, as the Amhara are discovering. This was a backlash nationalism framed around hostility and was bound to become unstuck. And the new war in Amhara is a calamity not just for the Amhara, but for all Ethiopia. Now, today, the crisis is a failing state and a disintegrating empire nation. And things have changed fundamentally in the last 5 years. Under Haile Selassie, the state didn't exist beyond the cities. Under the Derg, it didn't exist beyond the cities, the army, and the party. The EPRDF created the first truly administrative state that reached most of the country. And a generation of Ethiopians came of age thinking this was the natural order of things, not that this was a delicate construction that could crumble. And the language of democratization, of democracy versus authoritarianism, concealed the deeper issue of an institutionalizing state versus a system of government based on transactional politics, what some Africanist scholars call the politics of the belly, or what I have called the political marketplace. Abiy stood around admiring the view. He was caught in the avalanche. He inherited a state, he dreamed of an empire, and his legacy will be that he left Ethiopia with neither. Or perhaps we could say he succeeded in resurrecting the Ethiopian empire in the accurate historical sense of becoming an absolute despot whose authority does not extend beyond the first checkpoint outside Addis Ababa. He rules like a classic big man from the 1970s, like Mobutu perhaps, dispensing his powers of patronage and intimidation, presenting one face to the outside world and another to his domestic constituencies, constantly shifting his alliances, keeping his rivals challengers off balances. He's turning Ethiopia into Zaire. Now, for many African leaders, for many foreign diplomats, their response is, so what's so bad about that? Except that just a few years ago, Congolese envied Ethiopia instead of the other way around. There was a time when Ethiopian revolutionaries, whether they diagnosed the primary problem as one of nationalities or of political economy, could welcome disorder and upheaval because they expected a new order would emerge from such turmoil. But at the moment, I'm afraid we can no longer proceed on that assumption. The circumstances that make for state crisis make it inescapable. They're not Abiy's fault. They long preceded him. They far outmatch him. What is his fault is that he failed to understand the predicament and acted recklessly. But nonetheless, standing still is not an option on either the nationalities issue or the political economy issue. Time is not on our side. Continuing with the status quo will lead to state failure as night follows day. And the questions that we face realistically are how quickly the state will decay or collapse. What will be the contours of that decay or collapse? Complex, diverse states, such as Ethiopia, tend to fracture along ethnic or confessional lines. But those fractures conceal dysfunctions of political economy that are no less profound, perhaps more so. And for a gathering such as this, defined by ethno-national identity and solidarity, it will be natural to focus on that element of the existing crisis and of the coming one. But it is, I suggest, no less important to delve into the challenge of political economy. Because while the nationalities issue can be, we hope, resolved through political debate and engagement, the political economy issue cannot wait. It demands leadership and action. And that, I fear, is our predicament today. I wish I could end on a more hopeful note, but I'm confident that in your discussions today and tomorrow, you will at least be able to articulate and formulate some constructive ways ahead. I thank you.